let's go ahead and let's make a new project here. So I'm going to go and make a new project here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this game prototyping. Prototyping. And we'll be talking a lot about prototyping here. But the location, I'm also going to make it as Unity projects. And we also want to make sure that it is 2D only. Okay, so we want to make sure that we have a name, and you can name it whatever you want here. And I'll maybe make this Unity projects. And what that's going to do is, and if you really want to, you can go and select an item here. So what I might do is go to Documents here, and I might go to New Folder here, and I'll call this Unity projects. And you always want to back up this to the cloud here. So we'll choose that here, and it will say game prototyping. And if you want to, you could go ahead and put in, for example, P01 or something like that, P01 to tell you which prototype, or you can put the date in there or something like that. Let's go ahead and push create project, and this should go ahead and create the project. It might take a little bit of time. And if it does take a really long time, you can always pause this video and you can go and add that in here. Now remember, this is set up so that we can go and make our game here. We have the scene where we drop everything in, we have what the game looks like, and we have our assets and our inspector here. And all of these windows and a lot of these buttons will become very, very important to you and well known to you. So the first thing we need to do is add in a sprite. So we're going to go to Game Objects, 2D Game Objects Sprite. It adds in a new sprite, and I'm just going to go ahead and I'm just going to call this Player. Okay, so you can just click on that here, and if you want to, you can go and click on it, and what you'll do is you'll see that cursor come up, and you can go and just put whatever you want, push enter, and there we go. Now if we look over here, you'll see that we have the sprite renderer, and what this sprite renderer is how much the sprite will actually function here. So we also have the sprite, the color, we also have the flip, you can flip the X and Y, we also have the material, as you can see here, and then we also have a layer here. What we need to be concerned with right now is the sprite. Now, the one thing about Unity that Unity does instead of a lot of other programming languages is it allows you to only add in graphics here. Now, you can go and you can add in your own custom graphic at this point. But for now, what we're going to do is we're going to click on this little button here, and you can pick any one of these that will work here. I'm going to pick a square, and I'm just going to go ahead and close that here. Now, if we click on the main camera, you'll see that this is a preview, and you can see that little tiny dot. That is our sprite. Now, we do not want that to be our sprite here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the scale to X, Y, and Z. I'm going to change this all to 15. Now, at this point in time, we're focused mostly on learning how to code and add something to Unity. Graphics is not our main concern at this point, okay? So if we add in, and this has to be done to the player, by the way, so 15, 15, and 15, and you can see that now the player is indeed bigger. Okay, now if we go ahead and click on that main camera here, and we might as well set that to 1 to 1 to 1 again. Here you can see that the preview is indeed a little bit bigger. So if we run the game, look at that. It will take a couple seconds, but there is our player here. Okay, and you can go ahead and push the play key to play it, and the pause key to kind of pause the game. Okay, so here we go, and this concludes the tutorial. Welcome back. All right, so now that we have an object here, what we need to do is we need to add in some code. Now there's two ways you can do that. Okay, first of all, you can go to your assets window here, and you can go to create, and we're going to be only working with C# script here. You can go ahead and create a C# script, and if you want, you can see that it comes up with the C# script, and it will also add in the bottom here so that you can go and edit it. So for instance, you can say that this is my script, just like that, and there you go. Now, as you can see over here, you can see that there is a little bit of a preview, so you can see what it looks like. All right, so that looks pretty good here. Now, the other way you can do that here, and what happens now is that this script is kind of floating in space. It doesn't do anything. It's not attached to anything. So you have to attach it to the sprite. So you just simply drag it over, which I just did. And as you can see, under this inspector here, we have our transform, we have our sprite renderer, and now we have our my script. Okay, we have our my script here, and that is now attached to it. So any code that we write in there will now be attached to this specific game object. Now, if you want to, you can, for example, add in a component, okay? And you can see that there's a new script down here, okay? And if we click that, you can see that it gives you the language of C#, and the name will be, we'll call this sample script, okay, just like that. And I always like to make sure that there are no spaces. Call it an old school programming habit, but that's just me. So we go create and add. And now you can see that sample script is now up there. Okay, so there's two ways you can add those scripts in there for you. Now, if you want to, you can click on this little gear button, and you can go and you can say remove component. Okay, and that removes the component, but notice it doesn't remove the script. So we have to click on this, right click, and push delete. Okay, and we're going to go ahead and say yes, delete that, and there we go. Now let's double click on this here. Now what should happen is that this mono develop should pop up here. Now mono develop, if we kind of look at the icon here, it should kind of look like this. Now I always have them right next to each other, and if you're on a PC, it should also open up here. Now if it doesn't open up, there's two things. You might need to reinstall Unity, because it does come with Unity. And if Visual Studio comes up, then you need to play around with it in order to make sure Mono Develop comes up. Now, if you really want to use Visual Studio, you are more than welcome to. The reason why I'm using Mono Develop is because it looks pretty similar on a Mac and PC, so that most people will be able to see it here, okay? And here is our actual code. So we have our using statements, and these are accessing libraries so we can actually go make our game here. So there's code in the back end that we reference to make sure that it works. We have our class is where all of our work here, and we also have a start void and an update. We also have these comments here, right? And the way that a computer works is it reads the code line by line, and if you put in 2 slashes like this, it will not read that line anymore. So you can add in little notes and stuff like that there. Personally, I only use comments when absolutely necessary, but we're going to take a look at what the start and update void is in another tutorial. But right now we have this going here. Now before we end this here, I'm just going to add in one other item here. So right now we made a whole bunch of edits to this, okay? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to save it, okay? And if we go back into Unity, okay, you can see that now this script is now updated. Okay, it's different than before. You have to save it, because if you don't save it, the script won't update. And if the script doesn't update, all your code that you add will not be applied to the game. Okay, so let's talk a little bit, and let's actually do something in the next tutorial. Let's actually do something with this. So how do we do that? Well, let's go to our MonoDevelop here, and we're going to talk a little bit about how this void start and void update work. Okay, right now, let's go ahead and let's add in our own code here. So what we're going to do is we're going to type in transform, and as you can see, we have all these different options that automatically come up, right? And you'll also see, for instance, that there is this side here, and it gets a little bit transparent when I go and use the magnifier. So let's go to transform, and we're going to say dot rotate, okay, and then we're going to add in the comma or the bracket there, and you see you have different options. If you use the arrow key, you can add in all these different options here. Now the reason why this is that there's many ways you can rotate or transform, and the one that we want is this float x, y, and z. Okay. Now what we're going to do is we're going to just type in 10, 10, and 10, close off the bracket in the semicolon. Save it, and let's hop back into Unity here, and let's run it. Let's see what happens. All right. Maybe it might take a couple seconds here, but wow, look at that. That looks pretty good. Now, another thing you can do is you see that there's this kind of button here that says maximize on play. Well, if you don't push that, for instance, or if you go to the game here, and you can just see that it won't maximize on play. Okay, and that's actually something that works out quite well. And you can see that it is rotating here. Now, let's talk a little bit about what just happened. When you attach a script to a game object, okay, so remember we attached the script to the game object, and if we go back into the scene here, we click on this my script is attached to it. The transform, we are accessing that object that it is attached to. So transform is just another fancy name for this game object. Transform, game object, transform. So we got this transform, and we're telling it to rotate. All right. Now you'll notice that the square just keeps rotating. Okay. Now why is that? The reason is that the update method is constantly called, and it accesses something called the game loop. So for example, if we just drew a square on the screen and we put that draw in the update, it wouldn't update just once. It would update like 60 times a second. Okay? And what that means is that this update will get constantly called. So in order to make any kind of games, you need to constantly call this update. So if you think about this, and I play it here, the update method is getting called again, again, and again. Okay, so that's why it's rotating. Now, in contrast to that, if we copy or cut and paste this code in here, it will only do it once. Okay, so when a void gets called, it executes the code, it runs the code. Of course, remember to save it, hop back into Unity, and we'll run it here, and it will rotate, but it will only rotate once. And you can see that it doesn't animate there. And the reason for that is that the start gets only called once at the beginning of the game. So we have the start, we have the transform, it rotates 10, and that's it. So update constantly gets called, start only gets called once. All right, so that is how we can go and rotate, and that is the difference between void and start. Now, what we'll do is we will talk a lot about these two voids here, and we'll add in our own voids as well, but these two voids are super important, and we will understand how all of that works when we go and make our games. All right, this includes the tutorial. Let's take a look at something that's really important here, and that is the idea of variables. Now, what variables are going to do is they're going to store data. Now, we store all kinds of data when we make games. We can store in-app purchases, we can store the player's score, we can store the player's height. We can also store things like, the player's speed, projectile speed, jump height, pretty much anything that you see, anything in a game will be stored in some kind of data. Okay, so first things first is let's take a look at the different kinds of variables. So the first one we'll take a look at is an integer. Now, in order to declare a variable, we're going to say int, and we're also going to say integer, and we need to say int, which is an integer, which is a positive or negative whole number. We'll call this some int, and we'll make that equal to 1. Now, you can't make it equal to 1.34 because it's only counting numbers, again, positive or negative. We can also have a float. We'll call this some float, make that equal to 1.0f, or we'll make it equal to something a little more interesting, something like that here. So some float is 2.34f. Now, there's also another kind of variable called a double. We'll call this some double, make that equal to we'll make it equal to something like negative 7.77. Okay, and a double is also a number that you can use positive or negative, and it's also a decimal here. Okay, so we can add in another kind of variable called a string. Now a string, we'll call this some string, make that equal to Mammoth Interactive. Okay, and also, by the way, you do need a semicolon at the end of each line. So a string is characters. Now, a character is obviously, words. So if you want to enter a player's name or like a URL address or something like that, that's when you use a string. Now, the thing is that if I add another string here, we'll call this some other string, and I'll make that equal to 2. Well, here's the thing. With these number variables up at the top here, you can go and add them together. You can add ints together, you can add floats together, you can add doubles together. But what you can't do is add an int to a float or a double to a float. Likewise, if you wanted to add in this string here, and it says that it's 2, you can't add that to a number here. Strings do not add the same way as numbers do. So just keep that in mind here. Now, the other thing that we're going to do is we're going to add in a Boolean variable. So a bool is either true or false, and we'll say some bool is equal to false. Now, you can either make it equal to true or false. All right, so there you go. Now, let's say, for instance, you wanted to change the value of some int. Okay, so if you wanted to say some int is equal to 2. So when the game starts, because remember it's in that start void, some int will be equal to 2. Okay, and let's do, some int is equal to some int plus 2. So at the end of this, some int will be equal to 2, and then we will add, let's say 3, just to make it less confusing. So when the game starts, some int will be equal to 2, and then the next line says some int is equal to some int plus 3. So now it'll be equal to 5. Now you can add as many different kinds. You can multiply it, you can divide it, you can do whatever you want to that int. Okay? But again, what you can't do is go to some int is equal to some float. That won't work. You cannot mix and match variables like that. Data types are super important, okay? Likewise, if you wanted to do some bool is equal to false here, you can go ahead and change it to false. Okay? And there you go. So that is what variables are. Now, again, I'm going to give some examples. Now, these examples are just simply examples of things that I tend to use variables for. And what it is that it's supposed to give you a very good example of what use variables for. So, for example, I can say int score is equal to 0, int player width is equal to 10 or 12, int player height is equal to 12 here. And again, these are just examples of what I normally use. Float projectile speed is equal to 2.34f. Float jump force is equal to 1.1f. Now, by the way, you see how I don't capitalize the first word and I capitalize all the other words? That's so that it's readable. So for example, if I take out speed like this, it's still the same thing. It just doesn't look as nice, okay? Bool in-app purchase. We'll call this coins. Make that equal to false. All right. We can also have string player name. Now, one other thing, we'll just say temp name, just like that. And one thing you need to understand is that this looks like a lot of variables, right? When you make your games, and the more complex your games become, the more variables you'll have. Lots of commercial games will have 100 variables. Now, there's other ways to add in our data. We don't normally just use variables. We use other things as well. But for now, let's just deal with that there, all right? So, see you in the next tutorial. Welcome back. So what happens if we want to, for example, change the rotation rate in the editor here? Well, it's pretty simple. Let's go into MonoDevelop here, and I'm going to delete all of these variables, and I'm just going to delete the space here. And what we're going to do is we're going to make it a public float, and we're going to call this x rotation, okay? And make that equal to 10.0f. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy and paste that in once, twice. And since you can't have variable names that are exactly the same, I'm going to say y rotation and z rotation. Okay. Now, why did I choose floats? Well, remember, if we go back to this rotate here and we look at this float, you can see how it says float x angle. Well, you have to match the like variables with the like variables. So in this case, we're going to do x rotation, comma, y rotation, and of course, z rotation, semicolon. Now let's save that out here. Now, when you add something that's public, you can see it in the editor. So once this comes back here, you'll see that this script should go and update, and that update, you'll see that the rotation is there. Now, watch what happens when I run it, okay? So it'll run here and everything's working, and you can go and you can change it here. So you can change the x rotation to, well, 0. Okay. Now keep a look at these numbers here. Okay, so keep a look at this. We got 10, 0, and 0. And let's just stop the entire thing. Okay. Now if we go and stop the game here, everything moves back to 10. And the reason is that any change that you do when you are running the game will get completely erased when you stop here, okay? So why is this important? Well, let's say you want to build a platform game and you want your player character to have several different options that you want to tweak in the game, like jump height, jump speed, you know, bouncing, kind of, you know, whether it has, you know, certain kind of power-ups like a fireball or something like that. And you want to take a look at and add those in there as you're working with the game. That's when you make it public, all right? This includes the tutorial. Let's take a look at specifically voids here. Now, right now we have a start void and an update void, but can we add in other voids? And the answer is an absolute yes. So if we type in void, for example, let's say rotate the transform. Now, I haven't actually coded anything within rotate the transform, but you probably know what it does. Now I'm going to also add in the curly bracket here, and now we have the void rotate the transform, and this void works that everything within that highlighted area or anything within that curly bracket is indeed rotate the transform. Now if we put this, if we cut this and we paste it in here, we have rotate the transform. Everything should work out fine except for we haven't called rotate the transform yet. Now, if we call rotate the transform in the start, it will only call it once. If I cut that and paste it in the update, what will happen is that the program will run exactly the way it used to. So the void update will call this rotate the transform, and this rotate the transform will get called every single time update gets called. Now, this here, these two ways of making your program work is probably the best way of doing it. Adding in a lot of different voids that have specific functionality. Now, I'm going to add in some example voids. So, for example, void move the player. Okay, that's an example void. Another void would be, game over logic. And we'll move that will be the game over logic here. And you can see that you want to separate all of your functionality into this in here. Say void shoot fireball, etc. And again, these are just examples of what you can use voids for. Now, you should have as many voids as there are functionality. The reason is that if I was a person that was just coming onto the project and I see void rotate the transform, well, I think I know what that does. If I see move the player, I can guess what that does. If I see game over logic, I can guess what that does. And of course, if I see shoot the fireball, again, I can guess what it does. But if I write a void like this, I have no idea what that does. And you won't either, because sometimes you might go on a vacation and you can even go out for lunch, write some code, go out for lunch, and when you come back, you have completely forgot what you wrote. So you always want to be specific here, okay? So if we go ahead and save this and hop back into Unity here and run it, everything should work out just the way it used to, all right? Give it a couple seconds, and there you go. You can see we have this nice rotation transform here, okay? There we go. This concludes the tutorial.